Clara Martin stood outside the towering glass building of Terranova Technologies, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation mixed with the weight of judgment. The crisp morning air swept past her, brushing against her modest outfit, a simple black dress and a beige cardigan that, while appropriate, were a far cry from the high-end designer suits typically seen in this industry. But Clara knew that the true strength of a person wasn't visible in what they wore, but in how they carried themselves. And Clara had carried herself through the world's judgment for years. Unshaken, she entered the building with a quiet confidence, the receptionist barely glancing at her as Clara walked past, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. The sleek, modern interior contrasted sharply with Clara's humble appearance. The building was designed to project success, wealth, and power. And yet, Clara had learned long ago that success wasn't confined to these walls. It was everywhere, and it was hers to claim. The elevator doors opened to a high-rise floor, where she was escorted to the grand boardroom. As she entered, the group of middle-aged executives sitting round the glossy conference table turned their attention toward her. The way they looked at her, the subtle dismissals in their eyes, wasn't new. Clara was accustomed to walking into rooms like this, where every glance carried a message. She didn't belong here. At the head of the table sat Thomas Webb, the CEO of Terranova Technologies. He was a man of imposing stature, his pinstripe suit impeccably tailored, his demeanor radiating arrogance. He was known for being both powerful and deeply self-assured, two qualities that were often mistaken for invincibility. But Clara knew that invincibility was just a veil for insecurity. A person who needed to appear untouchable was often the one most afraid of being exposed. She walked into the room, her movements graceful but purposeful. She didn't hesitate or falter under their gazes. Thomas's eyes fixed on her as she approached, and for a moment, she felt the weight of his judgment. She had expected this. She had been preparing for this moment for years. With quiet composure, Clara extended her hand toward Thomas, offering a diplomatic handshake. It was a simple gesture, one that carried no expectations other than the traditional greeting that came with any business meeting. But what came next was far from traditional. Thomas stared at her hand for a moment, his gaze cold and calculating. He didn't take her hand. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, leaning back in his chair with a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The other executives, sensing the shift in energy, exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing in interest. "I don't shake hands with subordinates," Thomas said, his voice smooth, but tinged with a deliberate mockery. The words cut through the air, chilling the room. Clara did not flinch. She had encountered men like him before, men who believed that their position in the corporate hierarchy gave them the right to belittle those they deemed inferior. The room went silent, the tension palpable. The executives sat back, some with slight frowns, others with knowing grins, clearly finding amusement in the situation. But Clara, unbothered, withdrew her hand slowly and placed it by her side. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and composed. She could feel their judgment, but she refused to let it break her. "I'm not your subordinate, Mr. Webb," Clara replied, her tone calm but carrying the weight of authority. Her words were simple, but the way she said them made it clear that she was not intimidated, not by him, and not by anyone in the room. Thomas chuckled softly, as if her response were some form of entertainment. "Oh, really?" he sneered. "Then what role do you think you play in this room?" Clara's gaze never wavered from his, her confidence unwavering. She had walked into boardrooms like this many times before, facing men who underestimated her at first glance. She knew how to turn the tables, and she had done so time and again. She reached for her leather portfolio, pulling it open with deliberate calm. Without saying another word, Clara pulled out a single piece of paper and placed it in front of Thomas. The executives leaned forward, curious about the unexpected move. "I'm here to discuss a $3 billion investment in your company," Clara said, each word falling into the stunned silence like a hammer blow. Her voice was soft, but the impact of her statement was undeniable. The room froze. For a moment, Thomas seemed unable to respond. His smirk faltered, replaced by a momentary flash of confusion. A $3 billion investment. Impossible. His mind raced, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with the woman standing in front of him. There was no way she could be the decision-maker behind such a deal. She didn't look like someone who could hold such power. "What's this?" Thomas finally asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. He glanced at the piece of paper, as if it might reveal some mistake. "A $3 billion investment? Are you serious?" The room, once filled with quiet murmurs, was now eerily silent. The executives exchanged uncertain glances, but Clara remained unmoved. "I assure you, Mr. Webb, I'm not joking," she replied coolly, not allowing a single crack in her composure. "I'm here to decide on the future of your company, and the deal is in my hands." Thomas, still processing the revelation, tried to mask his discomfort. He chuckled nervously, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're telling me that you're the one who has the authority to approve or deny this investment?" His voice carried the faintest trace of mockery. Clara didn't react to the ridicule. Instead, she continued to observe him with a quiet intensity. Reading the subtle shifts in his body language, the slight nervousness in his eyes, she had seen enough. She knew exactly what kind of man he was: arrogant, dismissive, and deeply insecure beneath the surface. And it was that arrogance that would be his undoing. The other executives, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room, shifted in their seats, but none of them dared speak. They were caught between their loyalty to Thomas and the unease Clara had injected into the room. Clara let the silence hang in the air for a few moments before speaking again. "I've been assessing your company, Mr. Webb, and what I see here is a culture that's deeply ingrained with pride and arrogance. You've built a facade of success, but underneath, there are cracks. This investment decision is not just about the money, it's about whether or not you have the integrity to move forward." Thomas' face reddened. His pride had been wounded, but he wasn't ready to admit it. "Integrity? You think you can judge our company just by one meeting?" Clara shook her head slightly. "No, Mr. Webb, it's not just this meeting. It's everything I've seen, everything I've heard, everything I've learned about your leadership. And I'm afraid the answer is no." With that, Clara closed her portfolio, stood up, and walked toward the door. She had made her decision. As she left the room, the weight of her silence spoke louder than any words. The executives sat in stunned silence, realizing that they had just let a $3 billion deal slip through their fingers. And for Thomas Webb, it was a moment of realization he would regret forever. The heavy doors of the Terranova boardroom closed behind Clara Martin, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she made her way out of the corporate headquarters. The building, gleaming with success, stood as a monument to the very culture she had just witnessed inside, one of arrogance, pride, and, at its core, a lack of respect for anyone they deemed unworthy. It was the kind of environment she had become all too familiar with, the kind that thrived on outward appearances, where real power was measured by who you knew, who you could manipulate, and who you could dismiss. And yet, Clara knew, as she walked away, that she held the true power now. Outside the building, Clara paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the bustling city below. The skyline was a reflection of the world she inhabited, shining, pristine, and full of promise for those who could make their mark. But in her heart, Clara knew that it wasn't the city that mattered. It was the people who built it, and the people who controlled it. She had always been a quiet observer, but today, she had become an active participant. Today, she had reminded Terranova's leadership that power wasn't something you flaunted. It was something you earned, every day, with integrity, with respect, and with a commitment to something greater than yourself. But as she stepped into the car waiting for her, her mind was already on the next move. This was far from over. Back in the boardroom, Thomas Webb stood at the head of the table, staring down at the empty chair Clara had just vacated. His face was flushed with a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and frustration. The executives around him, once so quick to dismiss Clara, were now silent, unsure of how to proceed. They had all been blindsided by the woman they had underestimated. For a moment, it seemed as if the weight of the room itself had increased, as if the very air had thickened, with the realization that things would never be the same. "Did she just walk out?" one of the executives murmured, breaking the silence. His voice was tinged with disbelief. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rubbed his temples, trying to shake the shock from his system. "Yes," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "Yes, she did. Who does she think she is?" another executive added, clearly struggling to mask his own embarrassment. "Coming in here, making demands, and leaving like that. We're talking about a $3 billion investment. She can't just walk away." But Thomas was no longer listening. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that had just unraveled in front of him. This woman, this seemingly unassuming woman, had just thrown everything he had taken for granted into disarray. She had made him look small, like a fool. He had dismissed her. But what if she wasn't just some random investor? What if she was the key to something far greater than he had imagined? He glanced down at the papers Clara had left behind. They were simple. No flashy, oversized contracts. No complicated language. Just a clean, concise note about the $3 billion deal. And yet, as he looked at the piece of paper, it felt as if it carried more weight than anything else on the table. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, and Clara had made it clear that she held it. Meanwhile, Clara sat quietly in the back of the car as it drove through the city, her thoughts turning inward. It had been a calculated risk, walking away from the meeting, but she had made her point, and the reaction she had gotten from Thomas and his team confirmed that it was the right move. They were rattled and settled, unsure. Clara knew that, in a world driven by money and power, making someone feel vulnerable was often the first step in gaining the upper hand. Her phone buzzed in her bag, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from her trusted CFO, David Anderson. Everything is in motion. Waiting for your confirmation to proceed. Clara's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the message. She had known David for years, and his ability to handle the technical aspects of their investments had always been one of her greatest assets. Together, they had built a financial empire that spanned billions of dollars. And today, she would use that power to shift the course of Terra Nova's fate. But first, she needed to be sure. She tapped the reply button, typing a single word: execute. The plan was in motion now, and nothing, not even the CEO's arrogance, would stop it. Back at Terra Nova Technologies, panic was beginning to set in. Thomas had returned to his office, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was clear that the situation had spiraled out of his hands. His assistant, Jessica, rushed into the room, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Webb, I just got off the phone with some of our major investors," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "They're asking about the meeting. They want to know what's going on with this $3 billion deal. They're worried." Thomas turned sharply, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "Worried? What do you mean worried?" "She walked out of here without even a handshake." Jessica hesitated, looking at the floor. "I don't know, sir. But they've been talking. It seems like they're already hearing rumors, and I've seen some movement on the market. Stocks are starting to fluctuate." A cold chill ran down Thomas' spine. The realization hit him then. This was no longer just a meeting, it was a game. A game he wasn't prepared for. Clara, on the other hand, felt no such panic. She sat in her office, sipping a cup of tea as she reviewed the market data coming through. The slight fluctuations she had seen earlier had begun to escalate. As investors reacted to the news, selling off shares in Terra Nova Technologies, the company's stock was beginning to plummet. This was the moment Clara had been waiting for. The once proud CEO, Thomas Webb, had underestimated her, and now he would learn the hard way. The power wasn't something you could control with arrogance. It was something you had to earn, and Clara had earned it. As the numbers on her screen shifted, Clara knew that the battle had only just begun. Thomas and his executives would have to make a decision: either adapt or fall. And Clara would be there, watching, waiting for the moment when they realized just how big a mistake they had made. In the Terra Nova boardroom, the mood had shifted from disbelief to frustration. The room, once filled with laughter and bravado, was now silent, the weight of the investment hanging over them like a shadow. But Clara was already several steps ahead, and as they tried to regroup, it was clear that they were losing control. She had not only played her cards well, she had changed the game entirely. And as the hours passed, Clara remained certain of one thing: this was only the beginning. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city streets. Clara Martin sat in her office, the windows overlooking the sprawling skyline of the financial district. Her fingers lightly tapped the edge of her desk as she watched the events unfolding across the news. Her phone buzzed again, the messages lighting up the screen. The words were still the same, but now, the tone was different. The market had begun to react. Her trusted CFO, David, had confirmed it. Terra Nova Technologies stock was plummeting. Investors, spooked by the rumors circulating about the $3 billion deal, had started selling off shares. What had begun as a minor fluctuation had turned into a full-scale sell-off. Within hours, hundreds of millions of dollars in market value had been erased, and it was only getting worse. Clara wasn't one to revel in others' misfortune. But the truth was clear. Thomas Webb and his executives had underestimated her, and the price of that mistake was rapidly becoming too steep to ignore. She had played her hand with precision, and the consequences of their arrogance were now playing out in real time. Her phone buzzed again. It was an update from David. Stock is down 12%. Sell-offs are accelerating. We need your confirmation to move to phase 2. Clara took a slow breath, her expression unchanged. The game was now in its final stages. The market was no longer just reacting to rumors, it was reacting to the shift in power. But it wasn't just the stock price that mattered. It was the message that Clara was sending. Power wasn't something you flaunted. It was something you earned through respect, integrity, and understanding the rules of the game. She typed her response. Proceed. Within moments, the next phase of the plan was in motion. The financial world would soon feel the ripple effects of Terra Nova's downfall. Clara didn't need to make any public statements. She didn't need to confront Thomas Webb. Again, the market had already done the work for her. Meanwhile, Thomas Webb sat in his office, staring at the screen, in disbelief. The numbers were continuing their downward spiral, and his phone had been ringing non-stop. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, silencing the call before tossing it aside. He had always prided himself on being in control, but today, it seemed like the world was slipping through his fingers. He had expected a minor hiccup, maybe some temporary unease, but nothing like this. A $3 billion deal, from a woman he had dismissed with a wave of his hand. And now, the stock was falling. Investors were panicking. And the very foundations of his company seemed to be crumbling. He looked around his office, at the luxurious decor that had once symbolized success, now tainted with the undeniable sting of failure. His arrogance had led him to this point, and there was no escaping it. Clara had known exactly how to play him, how to push him just enough to make him react. But what Thomas didn't realize was that Clara wasn't just reacting. She had been calculating every move. She had set this in motion long before their meeting. Thomas had thought himself untouchable. He had underestimated not just Clara, but the power that true, measured leadership could wield. At Terra Nova Technologies, chaos was beginning to spread through the executive floors. The tension had shifted from disbelief to panic. Thomas' assistant, Jessica, was pacing nervously outside his office, her eyes flicking to the clock every few seconds. She knew that whatever had just happened wasn't just a setback, it was a full-scale crisis. But she didn't know how to help. Thomas had been a strong leader in the past, but now, he seemed to be lost. Jessica knocked on the door, entering, without waiting for a response. Mr. Webb, she said, her voice tight with concern. The investors are calling. They want answers. Thomas didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the numbers on the screen, his mind racing. Tell them I'm handling it, he said, his voice hoarse, trying to mask the uncertainty that was creeping into his tone. Jessica hesitated, watching her boss crumble before her eyes. They're not buying it, sir. They want a public statement, a reassurance that the company is still stable. The words cut through him like a knife. Stability. That's what he had always prided himself on. His company, his leadership, everything had been built on the illusion of stability. But now, as he sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, he realized that the foundation he had relied on was nothing more than sand. Get me a meeting with the board, he said, his voice hardening with frustration. I'll fix this. Across town, Clara's phone buzzed again. The update from David was now more urgent. Stock is down 18%. Terra Nova's biggest investors are beginning to pull out. We need to act fast. Clara leaned back in her chair, looking out over the city. It was a beautiful evening, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. But beneath the beauty, she could sense the storm that was about to hit. She knew what needed to be done. Her next move would be decisive. She had already executed the plan to disrupt the stock price, but it wasn't enough to just bring Terra Nova to its knees. This was about more than money. It was about making a statement that would echo through the corporate world. Her fingers moved across the screen of her phone again. Initiate Phase 3. The message was simple, but it carried enormous weight. Phase 3 was the public reveal. The world needed to know the truth about Terra Nova. The world needed to know that arrogance and discrimination had no place in the future of business. Clara had long believed that the real power in business didn't lie in wealth alone. It lay in the ability to influence, to change the game, to create real and lasting impact. The next morning, Clara's team released a series of leaks to the press. Documents detailing the toxic corporate culture at Terra Nova began circulating. The world would soon learn about the systemic discrimination, the culture of arrogance that had defined the leadership under Thomas Webb. The world would know about the numerous times that women and people of color had been belittled, dismissed, and pushed aside. As the press picked up the story, the floodgates opened. Social media erupted in outrage. Investors, once loyal to Terra Nova, began to pull out. The company's reputation, once a shining beacon of success, was now in tatters. Clara watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. This was about forcing change. About showing that real power wasn't held by those who clung to their outdated ways. It was held by those who had the courage to do the right thing. Back in Terra Nova's boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had once been a place of confidence and control was now a battlefield. The executives were scrambling, trying to figure out how to respond to the public backlash. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his face pale, his hands trembling. He knew the game had changed and, this time, he wasn't in control. He had underestimated Clara Martin, and now, he would pay the price. The storm that Clara Martin had unleashed continued to rage through the corporate world. As Terra Nova Technologies stock continued to plummet, investors and shareholders found themselves scrambling to salvage their investments. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force, Thomas Webb and his company, was now crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. But the most striking consequence of the chaos was the revelation that the once proud CEO had no idea how to regain control. The news was everywhere. Headlines screamed about Terra Nova's toxic corporate culture, the blatant arrogance of its CEO, and the discriminatory practices that had festered behind closed doors for years. Social media was ablaze with posts from former employees, now emboldened, to speak out about their experiences working under Thomas Webb. The hashtags #TerraNovaToxins and #WebDownfall trended worldwide as the story unfolded like a modern-day corporate tragedy. But Clara wasn't interested in the spectacle. She had never been one to thrive on public recognition. The true victory was the one unfolding behind the scenes. The one that would reshape the future of Terra Nova and send a powerful message to the corporate world. This was no longer just about the $3 billion investment. It was about forcing a cultural shift that would reverberate throughout the industry for years to come. Clara sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments. The leaks had done their job, and now it was time for the final step. The pressure was mounting on Terra Nova's board of directors. Shareholders were furious, and the company's reputation was in tatters. The decision they had to make was clear: either they acknowledged the need for reform, or they risked losing everything. At Terra Nova's headquarters, the boardroom had become a battlefield. Thomas Webb, once the powerful CEO, sat at the head of the table, his face ashen. His once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who was now completely at the mercy of those around him. The executives who had once followed his every word now sat in uncomfortable silence, each one aware that the company they had worked so hard to build was on the verge of collapse. The chairperson, Richard Bennett, who had been a longtime ally of Thomas, finally broke the silence. His voice was sharp, authoritative. "Thomas, you need to understand this. The company's reputation is beyond repair. Under your leadership, we've lost the trust of investors, and we've lost the trust of our employees." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I never intended for this to happen," he said, his voice strained. Richard interrupted him, his tone no longer sympathetic. "It doesn't matter what you intended. The facts are undeniable. Your actions have led us to this point. And now, the shareholders are demanding answers." Thomas' grip tightened. On the armrests of his chair, he could feel the walls closing in around him. The weight of his failure was suffocating. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice cracking with desperation. The board remained silent, their eyes focused on him, waiting for the inevitable. Richard Bennett leaned forward. "We've already made the decision. The board has voted. We are removing you as CEO, effective immediately." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His entire career, his life's work, was being stripped away in an instant. There was no fight left in him. He had underestimated Clara Martin, and now, as a result, he was paying the price. The rest of the board members exchanged glances, some filled with regret, others with relief. The decision had been difficult, but it had to be done. Terra Nova could not survive with Thomas at the helm. They needed a leader who could restore integrity, one who could bring transparency and accountability to a company that had thrived on deceit and discrimination. At Johnson Capital Partners, Clara's phone buzzed again. It was an update from David. "The board has made their move. Thomas is out. They've appointed Patricia Winters as the acting CEO. She's committed to the reforms we outlined." Clara smiled softly. She had known that Patricia would be the right person to lead the company through this crisis. Patricia had long been respected for her intelligence, decisiveness, and fairness. Clara had worked with her in the past, and she knew that she would be able to enact the changes necessary to turn Terra Nova around. With a deep breath, Clara set her phone down and stood up. The final phase of the plan was complete. Terra Nova was now on the path to transformation, and Clara had played her part. But her work wasn't over yet. She had sent a message not only to Terra Nova, but to the entire corporate world. Power wasn't just about wealth. It was about respect, integrity, and a commitment to doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. The next morning, Terra Nova's headquarters was buzzing with activity. News of the leadership change had spread quickly, and the employees, many of whom had been silently enduring the toxic culture, were cautiously optimistic. They had seen the company at its worst. But now, with Patricia Winters in charge, there was hope for a brighter future. Patricia stood before the company's employees in a town hall meeting, her demeanor calm and commanding. "We have a lot of work to do," she began, her voice steady and clear. "But I am committed to making Terra Nova a company that values transparency, diversity, and respect for every employee. We will rebuild from the ground up, and we will do it together." The room erupted into applause, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Clara, watching from her office, felt a quiet sense of pride. She had played a role in bringing about this change. But more importantly, she had given the employees of Terra Nova the opportunity to reclaim their dignity. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation at Terra Nova continued. Patricia Winters, with Clara's support, pushed forward with the necessary reforms. The company began to implement full transparency in compensation, conducted independent audits of its corporate culture, and launched initiatives to ensure fair and diverse hiring practices. Employees who had once feared speaking out now felt empowered to share their ideas and contribute to the company's growth. As Terra Nova's stock gradually stabilized, investors began to take notice. Clara had proven her point. True power came, not from arrogance or disregard for others, but from fairness, integrity, and respect. The changes at Terra Nova were a model for corporate reform, and other companies began to take notice. Following suit in an effort to adopt similar practices, Clara watched it all unfold from her office at Johnson Capital Partners. She had achieved more than just a successful investment. She had set a new standard for the business world, one that prioritized ethics and inclusivity over greed and dominance. Her $3 billion deal had been the catalyst for this change. But it was the people at Terra Nova, under Patricia's leadership, who would carry the company forward. For Clara, the victory was not just in the financial returns, but in the legacy she had begun to build. She had shown the world that power wasn't something you held over others. It was something you used to uplift them, to create lasting, positive change. As she sat back in her chair, Clara smiled. The world was changing, and she had played a pivotal role in making it happen.